On 882 6PR, inspiring stories for Barra and O'Day, generations of excellence since 1888.
Hello, my name is Tim McMillan. Welcome to another episode of Inspiring Stories, brought to you by Barra and O'Day, doing ordinary things extraordinarily well. My guest in this episode is a paediatric physician. He's an expert in infectious diseases. He's a public health physician. He's held so many titles and been bestowed with so many honours over the years, we could spend the whole hour listing them. But perhaps most importantly and of most relevance to the people of WA is that my guest is also the director of the Telethon Kids Institute, a beloved institution, I think it's fair to say, here in Western Australia. So it's with great pleasure I say hello and welcome to Professor Jonathan Carapetis.
Hi, Tim. It's great to be here.
Thanks for your time. That's a big role to play in this town, isn't it? Director of the Telethon Kids Institute. It's such a part of the community here. You know, the Telethon event is such a big deal on the calendar here. It's just, it garners so much affection in the community. What's it like being the director of the Telethon Kids Institute?
Oh, it's fantastic. It's such a great opportunity to be head of an organisation that, as you say, is beloved, is known around this community for doing good things for kids. And to be honest, to have the opportunity to take over from an iconic person such as Fiona Stanley. And I think she's obviously one reason why people love the place.
Yes.
And she's still our patron. She's still very connected to it. So I can't tell you how many times I had the comment, big shoes to fill, when I came in. So, in fact, I'm thinking of writing a book on big shoes.
Snappy title.
What an opportunity.
Yeah. You've been there now for, about 7 odd years?
Yeah, almost 7 years.
Yeah. You must feel like you've grown into those shoes by now, though.
Yeah. Look, the great thing with Fiona was that she let me carve my own space. So she's always been there for me as an advisor, as a friend. She's always been there for the Institute, but she also stepped back, as you need to when you hand over the reins of an organisation like that, and allowed me to carve out what I wanted to do with the organisation.
Yeah.
So it's been an incredibly busy time. We've transformed the organisation. Essentially, we've taken the legacy that Fiona gave us and taken the next step. In other words, but when I took over, it was about 21 years old. An iconic organisation doing amazing research, ready to understand what the future of research needed to be, which is somewhat different. And we've managed to change the organisation accordingly. It's grown. We've really focused on the impact, the outcomes of the research. And then, of course, most recently having the opportunity to move into new digs in the new Children's Hospital. So it's been a roller coaster 7 years.
I can imagine. Yeah. And you're finally in there.
Yeah, we are.
Which is great.
Which is great.
So what does a typical day look like for you then?
Okay, well, so I get up early, and that's because I have two teenage daughters who, look, it's wonderful, but it's scary because they're such musicians.
Right.
I'm not musical at all. My wife is musical, and so my daughters are very musical. And that's great. I love being in a house full of music. The drawback is that means they start school every day at 7 a.m.
Great.
Because they have they have rehearsals. Whether it's the orchestra, the choirs, you name it. And that means we get up early. So I'm up and around by about 5:30, and just sort of it's the morning, the chaos of the morning. Trying to get a bit of exercise if I can, and then I'm usually at work sometime between 7:30 and 8 o'clock. And then it's really, so when I'm in Perth, which is the majority of time when I'm not travelling, it's really at my desk at my desk a little bit of the time, usually in a meeting room, meeting after meeting. And most of the time is spent with strategizing, with meeting with researchers. I love meeting with the young researchers, trying to kind of mentor them and inspire them, and then thinking about what the next big plans are. How are we going to make the most of the talent we've got to bring a whole lot of researchers with other people together into big centres and big new initiatives. So my job is really, I've got a great team around me who kind of run the organisation, and I just have to check in on that. So the great thing about my job is I get to think about big new ideas, big new plans.
Yeah. And when you took over the role 7 odd years ago, how did that come about? You know, did Fiona seek you out? What were you doing just prior to taking on this huge role?
It's a really interesting story because I was the head of the Menzies School of Health Research in Darwin, which is a bit like the Telethon Kids Institute. It's an independent medical research institute. It's an iconic organisation in Darwin. Doesn't have quite the same status as Telethon Kids. It's a slightly smaller organisation. It's where I did my PhD originally, and I went back to become the director. And I'd been there for 6 years and had done a lot of the same sort of things I've been doing at Telethon Kids, building the organisation, focusing on outcomes, trying to bring people together. That had gone incredibly well. And we loved Darwin, and we were very happy there. In fact, when the opportunity to come here came about, we were literally about to sign the contracts on renovating our house in Darwin.
Right.
We weren't going anywhere.
Yeah.
And I got to say, when I got a call, I actually got a text from a good friend who is a doctor here in Perth, who I'd known in Darwin, who was associated with the Institute, and they just said, look, Fiona's announced that she's going to step down. You should think about it. And I got a few other contacts like that. And I reflected then on when I first moved back to Darwin in 2006. And the way I describe it, I was flying from Melbourne, where I was, to Darwin, but looking to the left outside the aircraft. Because at that stage, we all knew about the Telethon Institute. We all knew about Fiona. And we all knew that if you wanted to do child health research in this country, there were two major organisations, one in Melbourne, the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, and one here in Perth. And I think in the back of my mind, I'd always known that at some point Fiona was going to retire. I hadn't planned anything, but when the call came, I sat down with my wife and we thought, it's a huge opportunity to go back to an organisation just focus on child health, and obviously I'm a paediatrician, so that's where my passion is. But also to think about a place to live. We didn't know Perth very well. We'd only been here a couple of times, but we'd been very impressed by it. And the things we loved about Perth are the things we loved about Darwin.
Right.
We were quite happy to be a long way away from the hurly-burly of the East Coast. We liked the fact that the physical environment was just gorgeous. We're very outdoorsy sort of people. We figured it'd be a great place to raise your kids. And we also liked the idea of being in a place where you could do things a bit differently.
Sure.
So there was no strategizing around it. It was, you know what, that actually sounds like a pretty good opportunity.
Yeah.
That's how it came about.
And no regrets?
No regrets at all. We've absolutely loved it. The family has settled in beautifully. Gosh, what a place to live. You wake up every morning and think, why would you live anywhere else? The work has been extraordinary in what I've got out of it and hopefully what I've given into it, and the opportunities continue. And I think overall there's no reason why you can't do great things here in Western Australia. And I can tell you we've got plans to work together with the Children's Hospital to make it one of the best children's hospitals in the world, and that means research has to stand alongside caring for kids.
And were you given a blank slate for what you wanted to do when you got to Telethon? Obviously, you know, you mentioned the legacy that Fiona Stanley left behind.
Definitely.
The continuation of her work, but were you given basically just broad scope to then bring your ideas to the table?
The board wanted that. So when the selection committee asked me what my vision was, I laid it out. And the organisation was yearning for a different direction, and that's because it had been growing up for the first 20 years and wanted to understand how things might look a bit different in the future. I got incredible support from the board and then from the staff to bring a whole new approach to research. When I say a whole new approach, we were building on what we already had, but sort of doing things a bit differently. And I've got nothing but the support from every part of the organisation to do whatever I wanted. So that's very exciting, but it's a bit scary because you think, is anyone really keeping an eye on this? And they are, and I think we're going well. But it's been a learning experience for me to be able to take an organisation of now 700 people and who put their trust in you, and to make some big decisions. And by and large, they've come off pretty well.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
What are the big things that you still want to achieve in your time in the role?
Look, it's really interesting. We've just had what we call an external review. Scientific organisations do this every few years. They get up some of the great scientists from around the world to come and put you under the microscope. And that was a wonderful experience because they really looked at what we've done. They were incredibly complimentary about the organisation we've built, but they also were very clear that we were perfectly poised to take a major next step to become one of the great research organisations, not just in Australia, but in the world. And to do that by continuing to focus on what people want from research, which is to improve the lives of kids and families.
Yeah.
And that's what we've tried to separate ourselves from the rest of the mob by doing. In other words, to say, yes, we value a publication in a scientific journal. Yes, we value getting a big grant. But if we think that that's an endpoint, we're kidding ourselves.
Yeah.
Their encouragement to us, which we've really seized on, is to say, let's take on some of the big challenges facing our world, our community, our kids, and let's say we as the Telethon Kids Institute want to be part of solving some of those big problems, and that's what we're planning to do.
We need to get to a break, but after the break I want to really go back to where it all began, back to South Australia where you were born. Our special guest in this episode of Inspiring Stories, Professor Jonathan Carapetis. Back with more soon.
This is Inspiring Stories with Tim McMillan on 882 6PR. Brought to you by Barra and O'Day.
Welcome back to Inspiring Stories. This is an episode featuring the work of Professor Jonathan Carapetis, Director of the Telethon Kids Institute, among many, many other things. I want to ask you about your childhood because it sounds like you had some pretty pivotal experiences in your early years that perhaps set you on this path. But let's go back to where it all started for you, Port Pirie in South Australia. What was that like to grow up in? And how long were you there for?
So let's be clear about this. I was born in Port Pirie.
Yeah.
We were living in a nearby town called Crystal Brook at the time.
Yep.
I don't remember that because I think I was 6 months old when we left there.
Okay.
Having said that, that hasn't stopped the people from Port Pirie taking some of the credit. So when I got the big job in Darwin as head of the Menzies School of Health Research, the local Port Pirie paper ran a Pirie boy makes good sort of story. And I went back there recently last year because my cousin, who's an actor and a playwright in South Australia, she's now the artist in residence at the South Australian Theatre Company. She's written a play about the Greeks and Italians in Pirie back in the 1920s, and how they, the challenges they faced, and how they grew up, and how the women managed in incredible adversity was responsible for people like me today. And it's a great town, actually. It's people know it as the home of a lead smelter, and you're sort of wonder maybe I would have been smart if I hadn't grown up in Port Pirie. But it's a really lovely place to go. It's really good to rediscover it.
Yeah. And so your family, obviously, I'm guessing Carapetis is of Greek,
correct? Yeah.
Origin. Is that about you mentioned the 1920s? Is that about when the Carapetis family? Right.
That's right. So this is my father's side, of the Greek side, and it's my grandfather. So my father's father had come out. He'd actually joined his father, who'd come out between the wars when Greece was really kind of suffering, and the Greeks went anywhere they could to get work. They ended up in Port Pirie because the Greeks tend to go to where other Greeks from their part of Greece are. So that's why in Perth we have a lot of people from Castellorizo, and in South Australia, people from the island of Icaria, which is where Icarus fell into the sea.
Yeah.
They're the ones who went to Adelaide, but they often started by going up to Port Pirie.
Sure.
And they started market garden farms, etc. And so my grandfather came out, and there's some great stories about how he started. He used to go with his father, and they used to chop down trees and clear land. They used to burn charcoal until they could get enough money to buy an old clapped out truck to then take produce to market. Got enough money to buy a farm. And so my father...
Great stories, aren't they? I love
they're
those
fantastic.
Stories. Yeah.
So my father grew up on a little farm just outside of Port Pirie in a town called Nelshaby, which is a really tiny little dot, and has, again, fantastic stories of life on the farm, going into town. He was the only one of the family who ended up going to university. He got a scholarship to go to Adelaide Uni to study engineering.
Yep.
And he moved down to Adelaide Uni, and that's where he met my mother, who comes from English and Welsh stock.
Right.
And they had come out again during the I guess it was in the war, so probably about 1939, 1940, they'd come out from Cardiff to Adelaide, again, to start a new life. And actually, that was my grandfather on my mother's side was one of the architects for the town of Woomera.
Right.
And so he's got photos of him with all these people who, I think without an exception, all ended up dying of cancer. Right. Because of the kind of uranium mining and the nuclear testing and all that sort of stuff up there. So, it's really interesting history about how then my father and mother met at the university. Well, Dad was at uni, my mother was a trainee nurse. They met at a dance, as you did back in those days, hooked up, and that then started a really interesting story about the Greeks as to how they would react to my father going out with a non-Greek. And it wasn't a pretty story.
Quite badly for some of them, I imagine.
Yeah, so they were basically excommunicated for a while.
Is
that right? That all got solved, and my father's very much part of the Greek family, and we all are. But that was a really interesting time for them. So that's why I don't speak Greek. We were brought up as kind of non-Greek kids, even though all the relatives were very much in that Greek culture. My father's experience with the way the family reacted to him seeing my mother made him really think, no, we're not going to do the Greek thing at home. And I think we all kind of regret that now. But having said that, we've all, my daughters love being part of that Greek culture. Yeah,
I bet. And the food's pretty good too.
Yeah.
Tell me about your time then in Washington, D.C. In the 70s. Because this was a trip with your father, is
correct,
that right?
Yeah. So this is again, if you think back to the way your childhood has shaped who you've become, for us it was that idea that we moved a lot. So my father was a civil engineer. He worked with the roads authorities in South Australia. Then we moved to Melbourne. And so we moved a lot.
Yeah.
And then when I was in 9th grade, so third form back then, he got a job with the World Bank.
Right.
And the World Bank was this, I didn't know what this was back then, but all I knew was it meant we had to move to Washington. And I remember that I was very excited about that concept. My sister and brother weren't as excited, but we all went together. And I spent the last 4.5 years of my high school living in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And my father was, as part of his job, the idea back then was you're allocated countries. And so my father's countries were Uganda and Tanzania in East Africa. So he would go off there many times each year, helping them plan big projects around big roads and big bridges. He was a rural transport specialist.
Yeah.
And then every so often, my mother would get to travel with him, but he would bring back the stories of life in Africa.
Yeah.
So I guess me living in Washington and then also having that connection with understanding a bit about development in developing countries was a significant way of shaping who I eventually became.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the stories he brought back, an engineer is slightly different to being in the medical field, but those, issues around public health. Is that where the seed was first planted with you, do you think?
Yeah, without a doubt. So I didn't get to go to Africa until I'd already come to university. But he told me stories, it got me interested. I then also was going to a school that was an international school in Washington, and I think it was purely out of serendipity, but we focused for the last 2 years of my high school on Africa. So our literature was all about African literature. Our history was all about African history. I ended up writing a long essay about the president of Tanzania and his economic policies for Tanzania. So I became immersed in that world of understanding the impact of colonialism on emerging countries, the challenges they face with poverty, and of course I got to know a bit about the World Bank. And back then the World Bank had a pretty dodgy track record, essentially, of providing big loans to countries for projects that weren't always necessarily in their interests. And there were lots of criticisms about the World Bank, and that made for some very interesting dinner time discussions.
Some robust discussions around the dinner table, I imagine. You went back and forth quite a few times, didn't you, to Tanzania, in particular to an area around Mount Kilimanjaro?
Yeah, that's right. A town called Arusha, which is up near Kilimanjaro.
Yeah.
That's where my father was based. This is after I'd come back to Australia. I came back at the end of 79, start of 80 to start medical training in Melbourne Uni.
Yeah.
And about that time, 81, I think it was, my father moved to Arusha was seconded to an organisation there.
That's a hell of an adventure, isn't it?
Yeah, and he was there probably for the next 5 years, I think.
So just him on his own there? Did he have to leave you guys behind?
Yeah, my parents had split up by then.
Right, okay.
So my father moved there.
Yeah.
And the great thing, I mean, it was a bit of I don't know, it's a funny thing, but the World Bank allows you to travel twice a year to wherever your father or wherever your parents are.
Right.
So that meant I got a free trip from Melbourne to Tanzania twice a year.
Yeah.
To spend time with my father.
Yeah.
And that was great because I also got to visit the local hospital. I ended up doing a medical elective attachment there. So I got exposed to the incredibly amazing physical environment of Africa. We'd go on safari to the Serengeti, and we'd go hiking through the woods. We had amazing experiences, but I also got to spend time at the hospital and understand not just what the impact of poverty was, but the impact of poverty on health.
Yeah.
And that was in the days when HIV was just emerging.
That must have been incredible.
It was extraordinary because I was walking around that hospital looking at people who were just wasting away.
Yeah.
No one had actually had an HIV test at that time in Africa, but we all knew what it was. And I remember being there at the time they sent a blood test specimen off to Germany to get tested, and they got the first positive test back.
Yeah.
It was also scary because you would see the blood donations. I mean, you knew that all these people were donating blood and giving blood, but there was no testing for it. So it was kind of an out of control epidemic at that time. So that really got me aware of how people respond in adverse circumstances to the health problems of their families.
Yep.
And to be honest, it's no different to anywhere else. The devastation of a death in the family was just the same there as it is here.
Yeah.
It's just that over there it was much more common.
Circumstances were different. Yeah. The intersection between politics and public health, the way messages are transmitted about, let's talk about HIV specifically here. You know, there was so much misinformation, misunderstanding about what HIV was. Was that your first exposure to, I suppose, that intersection between politics and public health, and has that had a lasting impact on you as well?
Yeah, I mean, I've understood that really right from the start, and I guess that's why I've always had a bit of a public health leaning. Certainly, the experience in Africa and understanding the role that international development plays on the lives of individuals and on the health of individuals, understanding that trade policy, that the butter mountains of Europe back in the 1980s actually meant that the people in Africa couldn't trade for goods, and that meant that they couldn't get jobs, and that therefore affected their health. Yes, the whole politics around HIV in Africa was extraordinarily damaging. People who were in denial, the lack of access to medications, and it's only that countries like South Africa have stood up and said, no, this is not going to be good enough, that we've now got HIV being transformed into a chronic disease that people can live with rather than a death sentence. Now, having said all that, we've still got a way to go in a place like Africa to make sure everyone gets access to those medications. But boy, it's a long way away from what it was. I think the big experiences I had with, if you like, public policy, politics and health was in my early days was around tobacco.
Is that right?
Yeah. So I was in Melbourne Uni. I was part of the kind of anti-smoking group. And we had a thing called Bugger Up back then. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
I don't remember Bugger Up.
So
no.
Bugger Up is Billboard utilising graffitis against unhealthy promotions.
Right.
It's a, you should ask...
I could see why they shortened it.
Well, our current Western Australian of the Year, Mike Daub, was one of our kind of doyens.
Yeah.
So basically this was a whole lot of young people who would go out at night and go to the big cigarette billboards and we would reface them.
Wow.
It wasn't
you were quite the activist.
Oh, yeah. And I've got photos of me in front of these billboards where we'd basically use funny messages just to counteract their lies that they were telling.
Yeah.
We'd go to the Marlborough Australian Open and we'd just challenge all the Marlborough girls who were handing out cigarettes to the young people who were coming in to watch the tennis. And we really ramped up that whole idea that there was a major corporate drive to sell products that were killing people and make money, and to bring people's attention to that. And really ever since then, the story has been one of Australia taking the lead in saying the health of our people is much more important than the profits of these companies.
Yeah.
And that's, so I've been involved in that right from the start.
Yeah, right. That's amazing. We need to take another break. This is WA's Inspiring Stories, brought to you by Barra and O'Day. In this episode with Professor Jonathan Carapetis. Back with more soon.
This is Inspiring Stories with Tim McMillan on 882 6PR. Brought to you by Barra and O'Day.
Welcome back to Inspiring Stories. In this episode with Professor Jonathan Carapetis. We were just talking about smoking and your rebel behaviour in your earlier years there, Jonathan. Can I just ask you, so much has happened obviously in the campaign around tobacco, and I think it swung in the health practitioners' favour against the tobacco giants, which is fantastic. But now we've got this new phenomenon of vaping, which seems again to be quite a divisive one. Even people who are qualified medical practitioners seem quite split on vaping, and some argue that it actually has merits. What are your thoughts on it?
Look, it's a really important topic, and we are very concerned at the direction it's taking. I can tell you, I went to New York last year with my family. We had a holiday for 2 weeks, and I was astounded at how much vaping is going on. It is really an epidemic of vaping. You walk down the street and everybody's doing it. Why are they doing it? Because it's being marketed as a fun thing to do. It's if you look at the techniques the companies are using to market vaping, they are identical to what was used to market cigarettes. Was it
young people, kids that you were
yeah.
seeing, or all ages?
All ages, but particularly it was very uncommon in the older people. It was mainly in the kind of under 30s and certainly in the teens. So it was young people. It was, and that fits with the marketing. The marketing is all about it being cool and trendy, and they're using sexual illusions, and they're coming up with bubblegum flavours and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
So it's not being marketed as a tool to stop smoking. And it's not being marketed as a tool to stop you starting smoking.
Yep.
And we know, and there's very good evidence, that young people who start vaping are much more likely to then move on to start smoking tobacco. And we've got lots of data that suggests that this is a very planned strategy for the industry to get people into smoking. Now, that's not to say there's not a role for vaping, for e-cigarettes as a tool to get people off tobacco. There is some evidence that it can be an important part of the armamentarium for people who are established smokers, usually long-term smokers, as a way of getting them off tobacco. If that's the case, then it needs to be used as a medication. It needs to be managed, to be licensed as a pharmaceutical product, like any other pharmaceutical product. These things have dangerous substances in them, and we did some research recently that demonstrated that in that vapor are a whole lot of toxins that people aren't aware of. So it's partly we're partly concerned around the direct health effects of vaping. We're concerned that they're not being used for what people, I think, would think that vaping is all about, which is an alternative to tobacco, and instead they're being marketed as a tool to get people into smoking. And that's, I think, really dangerous, and we're seeing things happen overseas that we don't want to replicate here in this country.
So has the government got it right here, do you think? I mean, they allow it to happen. As I understand, you can't buy a lot of those vaping products here, but they don't necessarily stop stuff coming in from overseas that you might have ordered online.
That's right. So I think we need to probably ramp up the ability to control this, and we need to make sure that it's managed as a medication. So I know this government is very keen to make sure they don't do things well. We were very concerned at this recent inquiry that was promoted by the crossbenchers here about the nanny state. And I get concerned when people talk about the nanny state because, we want people to have freedom to do things, but it's not as though we don't have rules that protect people. Things like wearing seatbelts, things like not selling tobacco to minors. There's a whole lot of things we do that are there because they're actually really good for people, and it's not about government stopping people enjoying their lives. It's about making sure that people aren't going to kill themselves unintentionally.
I suppose another thing that's changed over the years since you were, climbing billboards to graffiti, a Marlboro advertisement, for example. Nowadays, people jump onto social media and become those, social media activists. Does that make it harder for you in your position and other people in positions like yours that are concerned about public health issues? Is it easier to tackle something like vaping in the era of social media?
It's not easier. It gives us another platform to use, but it's also a platform we have to
gives them another
off.
platform too,
That's
doesn't
right.
it? Yeah.
So we know that influencers are now the main way that tobacco companies are getting around the legislation. So the people who go on social media, you have a look at what they're doing. These major influencers that have, so many thousands or millions of followers, and a lot of them have tobacco or have cigarettes in their sort of posts. They'll have e-cigarettes in their posts. They'll have alcohol in their posts. So these are the new ways that companies are finding to get around the legislation around advertising to minors, for example. So we've got to be aware of that. It's really hard to control, but it is also an avenue that we need to make sure we jump on board in terms of promoting healthy messages. So just as these days, you get much less value for your dollar if you just advertise in a very traditional way on free-to-air TV or in the newspapers. You have to realise that the messages that people get increasingly are coming online, and we need to use those.
Yeah. Let's just go back to the chronology of your career. Tell us about your return, if you like, to Darwin, and some of the issues that you face up there, and what you were really trying to achieve during your time there.
Yeah, look, so I went to Darwin the first time in 93, 94, did my PhD up there, still worked as a doctor up there.
It's a wild place, isn't it, Darwin?
Oh, it's a fantastic place. Yes, it was very much a frontier, and the Territorians love being that sort of pioneer mentality.
Wild outpost. Yeah.
But it's also an incredibly real place. So there's no pretensions. You're in a town like Darwin, you're surrounded by people from all over the world. Most people are there for a particular reason. They're not there to be part of established society. Our kids would go to school with Aboriginal kids, with Malaysians, with Vietnamese, you name it, and we loved all that part of Darwin. So the idea that you're not surrounded by people driving BMWs when you drop your kids off to school.
Yeah.
We also love the connection with the Aboriginal culture, and indeed, if you ask me, that's something that the Territory really has to grasp for its future, for its economic future, because it's a third of their population and growing. So Darwin was a great place to live. Obviously, the work was it's like Australia's blend of high tech healthcare with some of, if you like, third world diseases. So the conditions I was researching were conditions like rheumatic fever, rheumatic heart disease, which is a problem that doesn't exist essentially in wealthy countries these days, but is a huge problem in developing countries, and we have a population in our own country that has amongst the highest rates in the world. So that's the opportunity you get in a place like Darwin. You're dealing with tuberculosis, you're dealing with people with very severe infectious diseases. And to be able to research and feel like you're tackling some of the biggest problems we face today, but you've got access to the resources that an institution in Africa would not have, that's a real luxury.
We're constantly getting, reports and updates about how government policy is achieving better outcomes for Indigenous Australians. In your opinion, are we, to use one of their phrases, are we closing the gap?
Largely no. The progress has been appallingly slow, and there's no simple reason for that other than if you ask me to name the single biggest reason, it's that we haven't truly partnered with the Aboriginal people to do this.
Which you hear all the time and seems like such an obvious thing to do.
Yeah.
Why is that so hard for a government to do that?
I think because if you think about closing the gap is such a big concept. Taking a whole population and essentially socially engineering every part of their life to focus on things like improving their health, improving their education, improving their housing, improving their employment prospects. And when you try and imagine what it will take to deliver these high-profile targets, you've got to sort of take a step down to a tangible thing you can do on the ground, and, for example, you as a public servant can do. And the lack of connection between what you as a public servant do and those big targets, I think, has been one of the big problems. We haven't made it very tangible for people. And therefore, when it comes to engaging Aboriginal people in coming up with the solutions, in the end, it comes down to an individual who's responsible for delivering something. And I just think we haven't allowed people the freedom to say, all right, let's truly go to a place like the Kimberley and let's talk to Aboriginal people and say, what would it take to change the lives of your kids?
Yeah.
And that's the sort of stuff we're trying to do right now.
We need to take another break. We'll have more with Professor Jonathan Carapetis, who's my special guest, very, very soon here on 882 6PR.
This is Inspiring Stories with Tim McMillan on 882 6PR. Brought to you by Barra and O'Day.
Welcome back to WA's Inspiring Stories. Tim McMillan is my name. My special guest is Professor Jonathan Carapetis. I mentioned before you've had so many different titles and honours thrown your way over the years, but this, not to embarrass you here,
here we go.
Jonathan, but at one point you were Northern Territory Australian of the Year, but you're also selected as one of Australia's 100 smartest people in Bulletin magazine. How does that sit with you? I mean, that's quite a nice thing to...
Oh, it's lovely. But, to be honest, I'm very realistic about that. Because I work in organisations up then in Menzies, now at the Telethon Kids Institute, where I am surrounded by really smart people.
Yeah.
People whose intellect outweighs mine several-fold.
Yeah.
What I get to do is be the front person, and I get to be someone who's kind of, I think, has a bit of a talent for strategizing and positioning.
And harnessing that brain power.
So I have no, I don't have tickets on myself. I get it that my skills in a certain area, I'm not dumb, but there's no way I'm going to win a Nobel Prize. So what I'm able to do, I think, is to represent a group of people and, if you like, a scientific community in a way that hopefully the broader public understands and accepts as an incredibly important and valuable part of our society.
I mentioned earlier as well, you are a paediatrician. Your wife is also a paediatrician. Yep. You've got 2 kids.
Yep.
How do you go, parenting? If kid sort of falls over and cuts their knee, do you overcompensate when you're trying to treat your children, given that you've got so much expertise under one roof?
So my advice to any kids out there who have 2 doctors as their parents, especially 2 paediatricians, is seek help. So we are hopeless.
Outside the home.
Outside the home.
Yeah.
So look, we've got stories of our kids when they've actually been quite sick. And when you're a paediatrician, because you're sort of dealing with kids who are really, really sick, you kind of let things go a bit, and you learn to when to delve in when a kid is really, really sick.
Yeah.
But it's not so easy to necessarily recognise it amongst your own kids. So we're notorious at kind of saying, yeah, they'll be fine.
You'll be right.
They've both got asthma, for example, and we've had times when we've really under-recognised and under-managed their asthma.
Yeah.
So look, we do what we can. We do make the mistake of trying to manage things by ourselves, and every so often we have to stop and say, you know what, we need someone else to look at our daughters to if they're sick or whatever else is going on. So. I think we do an okay job as a parents. But,
I'm sure you do.
And they're 16 and 14, so they've made it this far and they seem to be doing okay.
On a serious note, though, I mean, you're both in professions where you're dealing with sick kids. I think there's nothing more grounding, I think, in the community. I mean, perhaps there is, I don't know, but there are a few things as grounding and as humbling to people as a sick, vulnerable child, and you're dealing with kids in some cases who are not going to recover from whatever a horrible condition that they've found themselves with.
Yeah.
What's the emotional toll like for you? I mean, I imagine it'd be huge just if it was one of you, but both of you are immersed in that world.
Yeah, so there's some reasons you go into pediatrics. There's reasons around that being that these kids are innocent. So when you're dealing with sick kids, with very few exceptions, they haven't brought it on themselves. It's either been done to them or it's just really bad luck. Whereas if you're dealing with sick adults, half the time they've done it to themselves through their lifestyle or some other bad behaviours. But the other great thing about kids is, yes, they get sick, but almost always they get better. And often you have to help them along the way. But that's a really good story. You're dealing with families that are at a very vulnerable time. You help guide that child to health, and the family just loves it, and you get to watch that. But you're quite right, every so often it doesn't go so well. And obviously when you're in the cancer wards, for example, or some of the neurology wards, the stories are often not so positive, and yes, kids die. And that is absolutely devastating. And as a clinician looking after those kids, you you have to learn to manage that. You get used to it from the start. When I say get used to it, you never get used to a kid dying, but you learn to expect it and to recognise what your role is, which is to be a source of strength for that family, to be a source of realism for that family. And you also get to watch families often at their best in the hardest times, and kids at their best. I mean, I remember being on the cancer wards when I was training as a paediatrician, and there was a 14-year-old girl who was she'd had 2 or 3 bone marrow transplants for leukemia, and she'd had a further relapse, and she just said, "No, I don't want anything more. I'm happy to go. My time is right." And she just sat there like she was this dignified queen, and she brought all of her family members in one by one, gave them messages that they needed to hear, told them exactly what she thought of them, the good, the bad, the ugly, said goodbye, and gently passed away. And you think, wow, a 14-year-old kid to be able to do that.
I've got goosebumps listening to that. Yeah.
So you see it all, but it's one of the most rewarding things you can do to look after the most vulnerable in our whole community, and recognise that in doing that, you're not only saving those kids, you're not only protecting them, but you're protecting the future of our whole community.
Yeah. Do you miss being on the wards and being the person who is, I suppose, that first person that's directly responsible for a patient's welfare?
I still do a bit.
Yeah.
So I'm a very little bit, and unfortunately, in my role, I don't get to do the doctoring thing enough. But I still walk around the wards as an infectious disease physician because I love it. It really connects me with why I do what I do. It makes sure I try and stay up with the latest developments. I also think it's a really good message to send around the hospital that the director of the Research Institute is on the wards. It kind of reinforces for everyone the importance of that, of staying up to date, of the cutting edge nature of what we do, and of the importance of research to making sure that the Perth Children's Hospital continues to be a great place.
Yep.
So I still get to do a bit of it. I'd love to do more, but why did I go into research? I went into research because when you're a doctor looking after a kid, you can do something for that kid and that family. When you're a researcher, you can do something that will benefit a whole lot of kids and a whole lot of families.
Yeah. So if you had to sort of describe a future challenge as a holy grail in your many different research avenues, is there one that you would love to accomplish or to achieve under your watch as the director there? So
personally, for my own research, yes. And that's something we just got some significant funding from the government for, which is a vaccine for rheumatic fever. I would love, by the time I retire, for us to have that vaccine, and I think it's realistic. For the broader community, what I'm most interested in for Western Australia right now is to deal with the kids who are missing out, to deal with that increasing gap between the haves and the have-nots in this society that leads to our kids not getting a good start to life. So I would love all kids in our community, and that includes the Aboriginal kids, it includes the immigrant kids, it includes the kids living in some of the the poorer parts of Perth even, to get to school entry, to get to leaving school healthy and strong and not having to deal with the vulnerabilities that lead to chronic disease, to mental health problems in adulthood.
Well, it sounds like we're going to have to hang on to you for a little while longer yet. Then.
There's a bit of work to be done.
Do you see any kind of finish point for your time at Telethon, or you're happy here? You'll stay here as long as I'll have.
Yeah, I'm not going anywhere as long as they want me. I've just re-signed another 5-year contract.
Right.
We're loving it. We've got no intention to change. And I've got things I want to do with that organisation. We've done some great things. I want to take it even further.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for coming in and sharing some of your life story with us. And I'm sure I speak on behalf of all West Australians and say thanks for what you do and good luck with everything going forward.
Thank you, and it's been great to talk to you.
Thank you. You've been listening to Inspiring Stories here on 882 6PR. Everyone has a story to tell. This one, Professor Jonathan Carapetis, brought to you by Barra and O'Day, as always. We look forward to you joining us again next time as we unearth another WA inspiring story.